Hola a todos, hello everyone, and welcome to our special session convened by the UN Foundation, the next 8 billion and intergenerational dialogue on the future of multilateralism and multilateralism for the future. My name is Valeria Colunga, I use she, her pronouns, and I was part of the integral cohort of the UN Foundation's Next Generation Fellows, and it is my honor to be your moderator today. I am currently studying a master's degree at the University of Oxford, where I conduct research on intergenerational justice, and I also work as a Mexican delegate to the Y20, the youth engagement group for the G20. Just last year, the world's 8 billionth baby was born in the Dominican Republic, as you may know already. And today we will explore how living generations can meet our responsibilities to future generations. We will explore research on the next 8 billion people to be born, think about pathways for global cooperation, mechanisms to prevent and respond to crises, outcomes for the future, the Summit of the Future, and also future-focused leadership. The order of the day will be a presentation of the next 8 billion research, followed by an interactive panel with a Q&A portion. If you wish to ask any questions to our panelists, please feel free to do so through the chat. We'll be taking a look on it. So let's begin then. I will pass the screen to the UN Foundation Senior Fellow, David Stephen, who will present highlights for a new analysis of the 8 billion people to be born. Hey, David, how are you?
Great, thank you so much. It's great to be here. I'm just going to share my screen because I have a few slides to show you. I'm David Stephen from the UN Foundation. And I'd first of all like to start by thanking the organisers of the 23rd International Futures Conference, both for inviting us to run this special session and also for the excellent topic they've chosen this year around long-term governance, democracy, and the future, which is, I think, spot on. What we feel needs to be discussed at this time. This is a critical moment for the multilateralism of the future. At the UN Foundation, we were pleased to play a supporting role to the Secretary General in putting our common agenda together, his vision for the future of multilateralism. And in our common agenda, he called for a new way of looking at future generations. He said that the We the Peoples, which is the start of the UN Charter, needs to be reinterpreted not just to include people who are alive today, but to include all of the citizens of the 21st century. And that we, the citizens of the 21st century, also need to be thinking about the inheritance that this century will leave to future centuries. And he proposed a proposal that's been taken up by member states that we should have a summit of the future in 2024 to forge a new global consensus on what our future should look like. So we've got this kind of critical moment for multilateralism. And I've got 2 objectives I'd like to put on the table for this session. First of all, trying to reframe the debate on future generations in a way that's more concrete, more strategic, and more politically relevant. And secondly, to begin to bring together in this group a group of like-minded partners who are interested in the Summit of the Future, have a substantive contribution to make on futures research, on future policies, on foresight, and to bring them together in the beginning of a kind of informal network in the run-up to the summit. So moving on, as Valeria said, the world hit 8 billion people last year, and we began thinking about the question of what does the next 8 billion look like? And we posed 4 simple questions that have quite complicated answers. First, who will the next 8 billion be? Second, what do we know about the opportunities they're likely to face and the risks that they will face and the drivers of those opportunities and risks? Third, the question of what living generations should be doing to meet their responsibilities to future generations. And then for the international system, how do we build a world that is better at thinking about, planning for, and acting for the future? So what you have in this presentation and in the full deck that one of my colleagues will put into chat, and which was distributed ahead of this, is the beginning of an analysis that tries to tell the story of the next 8 billion. And you're very much seeing a kind of work in progress, a preview, something that we put together for this special session, and something that we hope to extend and develop in dialogue with partners as we move towards the summit of the future. Oh, what happened there? Seems to have gone through too many slides. There we go. So the SG called the 8 billion a milestone in human history, but we've been hitting these milestones with astonishing regularity. If you were born in 1974, which isn't really that long ago, the population was half the size that it is now. It's a kind of staggering change that's happened within the lifespan of this living generation. Even if you were born just at the turn of the century, the population was only just over 6 billion at that time. But this period of astonishing growth is coming to an end. And we're beginning to be pretty certain that the global population is going to peak probably towards the end of this century, maybe earlier, maybe later, but we are heading towards peak population in a period where most population growth is now driven by momentum, by the fact there's just so many young parents in the world that creates a kind of echo effect of population momentum. When we look at this 8 billion versus the next 8 billion, we see that they're in balance in just a 60-year period. Using the UN's median population projection, its reference scenario, we'd expect for 8 billion more babies to be born by 2083. And we're looking there at a population model that has really quite an impressive track record of success, that was able to predict the world population reaching 8 billion in 2022 within a couple of months, as far back as 1984. But this is not destiny. Demography is not destiny. It's a collection. It's a result of a collection of human choices, and we see a number of alternative models, both ones from the UN, alternative scenarios from the UN, and different models that other teams of demographers, population experts about the future put together, that see a peak happening much earlier and much later, and therefore see many fewer or more children being born. And this brings a kind of paradox of future generations. Basically, if things go well, we get many fewer babies born in the rest of this century and beyond. The date of reaching the next 8 billion is postponed into 2020 to 2225 to well into the next century, and the global population would actually peak in mid-century, the middle of this century, and have fallen back down towards 6 billion by the end of the century. So SDG successes in education and empowerment of women, in building peaceful, just and inclusive societies, leads to a much smaller future generation. Conversely, if things go badly, if current trends increase and worsen, then population fertility stays higher in the countries where it's high. The next 8 billion is born sooner. The global population takes a lot longer to peak, and we have a larger future generation facing greater risks, enjoying fewer opportunities, and being born into a more unstable and probably less peaceful world. But then there's a point where this paradox breaks down. If things get bad enough, we could have catastrophic existential risks that threaten the survivability of humanity, or cut the population dramatically and quickly. Or we could begin to see a dramatic worsening of the current climate and planetary trends, beginning to squeeze the niche in which humanity has thrived through its history. So a bigger generation, if it goes badly, until something really bad begins to happen, and then we start to see rapid population loss. I think this paradox encourages us to look beyond the absolute numbers to the distribution of the and you see in this graph where we would expect the 8 billion to be born under the UN's median scenario, and we see that they're very much largely born in Asia and in Africa, around 86% born in those two regions, and we see quite dramatic changes in the distribution by country. So India remains incredibly large, by far the dominant country. but more people would be expected to be born in Nigeria than China, for example, in DRC than in Indonesia. This begins to bring home questions of intergenerational equity. The future generations, the next 8 billion, is born mostly in what are currently low and lower middle income countries, around 75% in those countries. And they would be born in to families and in communities with extremely great unmet human development needs. And you begin to see there the virtuous cycle where if education, economic opportunities, human development improves, then fertility drops faster, and that's precisely where the future generations begin to be born into more promising circumstances. We like in our analysis to slide to move on to distinguish between what we call living majority and future majority countries. So a living majority would be a country that has more people in the current 8 billion than in the next 8 billion, and a future majority is balanced towards the future generations, has more people in the next 8 billion. And we've got a lot more detail on this in the full deck, but we only have one region that has a future majority, and that is Africa. You can just see the very, very big difference between current living generations and future generations in the African region. Asia has a living majority, mostly because of China. There are many future majority countries in the region, and you can see Europe, how pronounced the living majority is there. That's again then replicated with income groups, and we see the low income groups and low middle income groups having very strong future majorities. So, what does this mean? I think it pushes us in 4 directions. First of all, it starts to make us not have kind of abstract hand-wavy concerns about future generations, but to actually be concrete and tangible about what the science and what the evidence is telling us about who future generations are, where they're likely to live, what we could think their needs are likely to be. Secondly, it brings the future much closer to home. This is not a problem that can just be deferred out into a concern just about long-term factors. This is about decisions that's taken in the here and now within the SDG agenda that will affect the lives of the grandmothers, the mothers, the parents, the grandparents of future generations yet to be born. So the concerns about the present, about equity in the present, spatial equity in the present, are tied to the concerns about intergenerational equity that take us into the future. Third, this begins to become a concrete policy agenda, not just a debate about problems, but a debate that begins to take us into solutions and how to target those solutions in the sectors and geographies that are going to do much to secure and shape the future. And finally, there's a political question here. The countries, the places that need to be most represented in this debate are the countries and places where the future generations are most likely to be born. And those are not currently the countries that have the predominance of investment and interest in foresight and thinking about the future. So if we want to talk about future generations, we need to do that with young countries taking a leading and driving role in the debate. Let me close with just a bit of a shopping list of some of the policy areas that I think this implies that we need to start exploring. And again, to emphasize, this is the beginning of an analysis that we hope to build towards the summit of the future. So quickly to whiz through this. One, what are the smart buys of the future? If we look into the SDG agenda, where are the investments that are going to make most difference to securing a future for future generations? Secondly, the question of how economic growth happens, where it happens, how it adapts to a very fast changing global economy, and what that means for the prospects of future generations. Third, the question of migration, which is very poorly modeled in the current demographic models that we have now. Crudely and simplistically, do opportunities move to where the young people of the future are going to be, or do the young people of the future move to where the opportunities are going to be? And what's the factors that risk plays in driving people to move from one part of the world to the other. Or obviously the question of the planetary emergency of climate, of biodiversity, etc. The questions that are being grappled with today, but particularly thinking about if we are to engage in some transition to a greener and more sustainable future, is that going to be done in a way that benefits the parts of the world where the future is going to be born? Fifth, often forgotten about, but the intergenerational impacts of conflict, of violence, of political instability in a world where we can, within days, weeks, months, we can really very significantly damage a society, and then it takes years, decades, centuries to rebuild institutions for the benefit of future generations. Six, a question we're going to hear about from Ruth and from others on the panel, the question of catastrophic and systemic risks, how we get better at understanding and managing and preventing those in a world where seemingly once in a generation emergencies happen about every 2 years or so. And then finally, 7 and 8, the questions of governance. Governance within countries, particularly young countries with future majorities, the governance that you need to get better at preparing for the future, and governance within the international system. Back to this question of building an international system that can help us think, plan, and act for the future in a way that puts the interests of future majority countries at its heart. So that's the work that we're just beginning to explore. I hope that we're going to hear from panelists and from people about the floor some of their perspectives on these issues. And this is really an invitation to start a conversation with us today, to think about what's going to happen at the Summit of the Future in 2024, and then to think how we can use that to build a platform. With that, back to you, Valeria.
Thank you so much, David, for sharing this exciting information about future generations and what's next on the research for intergenerational justice. I know that we have already shared the links for some of this information that you have shared with us, so please feel free, audience, to take a look at that for future reference. And now I'm super excited that we're going to begin with our interactive panel. We have with us 4 incredible panelists. First of all, we have Ruth Richardson, which is the Executive Director of the Accelerator for Systemic Risk Assessment, ASRA. Welcome, Ruth. We also have Khalid Mashat, who is the Royal Policy Advisor from the Special Commission on Development Model from the Kingdom of Morocco. As well, we have with us Claudette Salinas Leiva, a UN Foundation Next Generation Fellow who focuses on future generations. And as well, we have Abdullahi Alim, who is head from the Project 2030 from the International Chamber of Commerce. Welcome, everyone. We're so excited to have you here. And thank you for having the time to meet with us for this exciting topic. We'll just get right into it so we have some time for answering these questions. So we will begin with you, Ruth. You lead an initiative that aims to help decision makers understand and respond to the systemic risks that the world faces. So we're super interested in knowing how can we increase the collective capacity to prevent and manage crises? And why do you think it is important for future generations?
Thank you so much, Valeria. And I'm so pleased to be invited to join everybody today on this critical topic. I want to tell you a little bit about ASRA. It's a new initiative to catalyze the field and practice of systemic risk analysis, with particular attention to helping leaders and practitioners, especially those in the public sector, better understand, assess, and incorporate sensitivity to systemic risk into their decision-making. Launched in February of 2023, so very new, we are an independent initiative housed at the United Nations Foundation and kindly enabled by philanthropic donors. We're building a collaborative, diverse network of practitioners and thought leaders drawn from across continents, cultures, genders, and generations who recognize how systemic risk assessment can not only help us understand and anticipate crises, but has a key role in preventing and managing crises by identifying solutions and building resilience to risk over time. So why ASRA? In short, we aim to advance public, systemic risk assessment and response. These, the three words that I emphasized, I want to elevate briefly because they speak to what we believe are ASRA's unique contributions. So the first word is systemic. We define systemic risk as the potential for multiple, increasingly severe, abrupt, complex impacts on natural and human systems that are intertwined. These impacts evolve, they interconnect with one another, and they're potentially long-lasting. So what does this mean? Well, traditional risk assessment tends to happen in silos: climate risk, health risk, peace and security risk, technological risk, and so on. What traditional risk assessment does not do is look at the interconnected nature of these risks, how each impacts and reinforces the others. So for example, war impacts climate risk, which impacts health risk, which impacts social stability, which impacts political security, which in turn impacts the likelihood of war. This is a simplification, of course, but it's the interconnected and reinforcing natures of multiple risks that is important here and is leading to what is increasingly called the polycrisis. So traditional risk management and governance approaches are not up to the job to understand and act on the complexity of today's challenges. The second word I'd like to elevate is public. Traditional risk assessment is primarily rooted in government, particularly the military, and in the private sector, making it either classified in government or proprietary in the private sector. So this is another aspect of systemic risk assessment that ASRA aims to bring forward, which is this public risk assessment that is open, transparent, and accessible. It's a sort of risk assessment for the people, if you will. The third word to underline is response. There is an accelerating gap between the risk to which society is being exposed and our capacity to deal with the consequences. So we have to adjust our decision-making and knowledge tools to fit and enable us to face the polycrisis. So we aim to identify bright spots, find innovation on the other side of disruption, and balance the doom and gloom online and in the media with opportunity and possibility. For future generations, the next 8 billion who will be most impacted by our failure to connect dots, unpick the knots, and build the foundations for a better future, we believe that public, systemic risk assessment and response is both a responsibility and a call to action. So that's a little bit about ASRA. And with the few minutes I have left, I'd like to just speak to 3 critical opportunities for the role of systemic risk analysis and response in our world today. The first opportunity is dialogue and cooperation. Systemic risk assessment can inform action that secures a fair future and strengthens the bonds between today's and future generations. How future risks will unfold cannot be fully predicted, but we know that they will aggravate and compound vulnerabilities in existing systems. They will interact with other risks, creating significant consequences. And importantly, the cascading impacts will pay no attention to geographic borders. After 2020 and the outbreak of the pandemic, we understood how all of us around the globe are interlinked. So systemic risk assessment can play an active role in strengthening dialogue and cooperation by practically creating linkages across policy portfolios and issue agendas. Systemic risk assessment breaks down the barriers between science and policy, disciplinary and institutional silos, north and south, sort of the masses and the elites, the young and the old, leading to the co-creation of knowledge and solutions that reflect their context, creating the foundations for positive futures and strengthening intergenerational dialogue. The second opportunity is to unleash action and agency. The practice and application of systemic risk assessment can inspire and enable a multiplicity of action. We have designed, built, and now maintain systems, political systems, economic systems, social, technological systems, despite the growing evidence that these systems are not serving us or this wondrous planet well. So we need to reimagine and rebuild new systems. And to do so will require a multiplicity of responses, from policy to direct action, to new business models, to different participatory processes, to stronger governance models. Responses at the national and local level present high leverage intervention points, but we also need cross-sector collaborative action at the multilateral level too. Multilateral platforms and spaces like this have the opportunity to lift up the stories of resilience and systems-based action, open up political space to imagine the possible, and help reinforce our agency in the face of needed change. Finally, the third opportunity is principles. Decision-making to anticipate, mitigate, manage, and respond to known and unknown risks of the future must be firmly rooted in principles. Risk assessment and response inherently contain value judgments. When one starts talking about risk, one is immediately confronted with questions of risk for who and risk from what. This matters deeply because it's no longer about risk to a bank's balance sheet or a country's border or an insurance company's payout. No. At this juncture in history, it has to be about risk to vulnerable communities, risk to our ecosystems and the very functioning of our planet, and risk to future generations to live free of the risk previous generations have created. These concerns lead to principles such as commitment to human rights, upholding the public good, equity, a recognition of the intrinsic value of all living beings, including non-human species, and taking seriously our responsibility to the rights of future generations. These principles are powerful social technologies that can inform and guide shared action by telling us how to act and assisting us in bending the arc of these crises in a positive direction. Principles have been an important guide to the work of the United Nations and so many others. For example, as the basis of the UN Charter itself, the Declaration of Indigenous Peoples, the Rio Declaration on Environment and Development, and so on. And we hope at ASRA to make a contribution to our collective global efforts as we face current crises and aim to mitigate our collective risks of an uncertain future for those that will walk after us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ruth. I mean, I took already so many notes, dialogue, action, principles. These are things that I think we definitely need to think of moving forward. Now I'm going to move with Khalid Mashad, who, I mean, as we previously discussed, he's the Royal Policy Advisor from the Special Commission on the Development Model from the Kingdom of Morocco. Khalid, you were a member of the Special Commission that developed a new model, as we mentioned, of Morocco's development. With around 40 million Moroccans projected to be born in your country for the rest of the century, can you please tell us more about how the Commission has considered the needs of future generations and how it assesses Morocco's future risk and opportunities? I mean, as Ruth said, risk assessment is one of the things that we need to be thinking
of. Thank you very much, Valeria, and to the team for the invitation. So the work we've done on the Royal Commission was mainly focused on kind of getting this long-term vision on how to assess and manage systemic risks, especially after COVID and after the financial issues that the world has been through. It was time to focus on solidifying the socioeconomic base and to support industries and activities that would enable our future generations to feel more comfortable, have more opportunities locally instead of having to look to other areas around the world to access those opportunities. And so some of the work we've done focused on how do we kind of unify access to base needs. So for example, last year we've launched a transition to a nationwide fully accessible Medicare, which was not the case before. So even for citizens who do not have the capacity to pay for Medicare or for insurance, that they would be covered all the same. And how do we try to also cover that from a financial standpoint? Obviously, we don't have unlimited resources. So the focus on that was to how can we also work on exploiting national resources in a smarter, a more perhaps technologically supported way in order to be both frugal with the resources, but also make them last and work a long way. Also integrating circular economy into how we develop each region's economic activities. So Morocco has 12 regions, and our work was also focusing on how do we make sure that each region kind of develops its own economic activity, so that people from that region don't have to move to larger cities. For example, Casablanca, which is our kind of largest metropolitan area, and we've seen a lot of migration, internal migration to Casablanca, because that's where all the activity is, historically speaking. And so our one of our roles was to try and work with each region on trying to understand how we can develop their own activities that's based on what the region is most known for, what it can work on, and what can provide for its future generations. All of this, obviously, in the understanding that we need to also transition to more globalized approach to education and to opportunity access. So, for example, this year we've introduced English in middle school, so as to be taught. I don't know if you have an idea, but Morocco has Arabic and French starting through elementary school, but English was only taught through starting high school. And then we get into a kind of an issue at university level where we have no possibility of integrating with other systems around the world, and most of the scientific material is English written or English based. And so this was one of also the areas where we worked on. And then finally, how do we introduce technology to support each of these components? We started working on telemedicine to support the generalization of healthcare across the country, as well as leveling up teachers for middle school that will be starting to teach English, or that will be starting to teach scientific courses in other languages or in other disciplines. We've started developing technological tools to remediate that, and in order to kind of also diminish the amount of financial resources we have to use to skill up the teachers. Instead of having them in physical spaces, we can work on digital tools as well. So this is just to give you a few examples of how the National Development Commission has tried to work on strategically implementing nationwide reforms in order to prepare for the future generations.
Thank you, Khaled. This is incredibly interesting. I'm so intrigued by how you were talking about almost these two different dimensions, right? Bringing the global perspective to Morocco, while also taking into consideration the local and domestic needs of the people, which I think is such an important point when it comes to thinking about intergenerational justice and what that means for future generations, balancing this local and global aspect. Talking about future generations, we will now move with Claudette, who is a Next Generation Fellow. Claudette, I mean, you work on future generations as a Next Generation Fellow. You already know half of the world's population are under the age of 30, and most young people can expect to live deep into the century. With, of course, some of them still living in the next century. So I'm very interested, from one Next Generation Fellow to another, how is the new cohort of the Next Generation Fellow leading intergenerational dialogue on future generations? And can you please share more with the audience about this incredible work that the UN Foundation is leading?
Yes, certainly. Thank you, Valeria. I would like to thank the organizers for convening a dialogue on this topic and for the opportunity to participate as a Mexican researcher, because although my degree is in law, I was drawn to futures work out of a sense of rebellion. After all, what could be more defiant than a Mexican choosing hope in the face of adversity? And what could deliver a greater sense of justice than focusing on intergenerational equity, ensuring that future generations inherit a world no less abundant than the one we enjoy today? Since serving as a UN Foundation Next Generation Fellow and focusing on future generations, I've never felt more satisfied, because this program was conceived in 2021 in response to a Secretary General's call in the Our Common Agenda process. Ever since, we have been spearheading such intergenerational dialogue in two main ways. First, by fostering connectivity, and second, by inspiring and being inspired by the young people we work with. So with nearly half the global population under 30, we've never had more potential young leaders to draw from. And this made it possible to bring together over 2,500 emerging leaders worldwide for the Big Brainstorm, which was a 2-week design sprint in February, fostering the connectivity that is so integral to our program. These young thinkers and activists were central in launching 24 innovators to confront humanity's pressing challenges. And in designing such events, we had not only drawn on the rich potential of the largest youth generation in history, but also adapted to their cultural and contextual realities, such as the changing shape of our world population, with it being estimated that 9 out of 10 people will be living in Asia and Africa by 2100. And my role in this project has been transformative, making me feel a bit less alone in my advocacy journey. The significance of this has proven that young people have the drive, the creativity, and indeed the capacity to turn their ideas into actionable projects that can drive social change. When given the space, the support, and the trust, we follow through on projects, push the boundaries of what exists, deliver with fresh thinking, and always look for a broad spectrum of possibilities. This brings me to a second cornerstone of our program, which is inspiring and being inspired by the passion and capacity of young leaders. Because over 4 months, young leaders from Argentina, Bolivia, Nigeria, Uganda, and many others have shown exceptional resilience and empathy in our Future Generations Action Group. For instance, we've undertaken collaborative projects with Indigenous peoples, crafting connected platforms to deeply comprehend and magnify their actions and apprehensions about the future. Our goal is to ensure their heritage is preserved for generations to come in a manner that respects their perspectives. In another initiative, Felipe Bosch, who is in the audience, aims to amplify youth voices in decision-making processes. After conducting a global survey on how young people envision the future, he's developing a toolkit of foresight exercises designed to equip them when participating in intergenerational dialogues. Our team will pilot this toolkit in 3 countries, leading up to local summits of the future before the one in 2024. Basically, hailing from various countries, predominantly from the Global South, or as we like to call it, the majority world, leading the action group has been energizing. This geographical distribution demonstrates the commitment to ensuring that voices from traditionally marginalized regions have a central role in our intergenerational dialogue and in shaping the world's future. Because as we look towards 2100, demographic trends indicate that many wealthier nations are on a trajectory towards a rapidly aging population, with anticipated decreases in population size by as much as 40%, and the majority of citizens over 60. Now, how can we say we are designing a collective future in an homogeneous group? To solve this power imbalance, we must address the elephant in the room, inequality. We hold immense potential to craft a fairer tomorrow, but to do so, it's imperative to authentically understand and represent the different groups that will constitute it, who they are and where they're based, because Global South doesn't equal monolithic. And this isn't merely about advocating for more representation from future majority countries for the sake of it. That will be a superficial interpretations. Instead, it's about appreciating how these distinct worldviews enrich our collective wisdom and enable us to future-proof our world without perpetuating past injustices. Reflecting on this brief journey of 6 months, I marvel at the blossoming of what once was a scarcely perceptible movement in contexts such as mine. In my role, I have observed friendships and collaboration sparking and intergenerational discussions flourishing, a testament to our abilities and the vital role young people play in shaping our collective future. Finally, if you're eager to learn more about our work, I invite you to visit the Our Future Agenda website, where we are always looking for new partnerships. Let us remember that a booming youth population can unlock unparalleled potential if paired with adequate investment in young people and through intergenerational partnership. And now, finally, in wrapping up, remember this: our choices today echo into the shape of tomorrow. During this 7-minute intervention, we've welcomed over 2,000 new members into our global home. Let's strive to ensure that the echoes they hear throughout their lives are ones of hope, sustainability, and a future generation, a future filled with opportunities for all. Thank you.
Thank you, Claudette, for this amazing intervention. And please, to the audience, we have shared the link for our future agenda in the chat in case you're interested in learning more about this work. I mean, I feel like one of the main takeaways, Claudette, from what you mentioned is the importance of looking at that design of how we talk about intergenerational justice, right? We cannot talk about intergenerational justice without the intergenerational perspectives. And I think that's the importance of the Next Generation Fellows, bringing this diverse, not only cultural, but generational perspectives on what the future of the world and generations means. So thank you so much for this incredible comments and inputs. We're going to move to Abdullahi Alim, head of Project 2030. Abdullahi, you work in the International Chamber of Commerce, and you are a voice for 45 million businesses, many of them in countries where, as we have heard already, the majority of future generations will be born. I'm interested in knowing if you have any concrete ideas for how businesses should invest in the future. And furthermore, following these interventions, I would like to also know whether you think there's anything we need to think about the Summit of the Future and how businesses should be engaging in this multilateral perspective and conversations.
Thank you very much, Valerie, and thank you to the organizers for making today's discussion possible. I will also maybe start with a bit of context with the ICC. We are a post-centennial organization. We've been around for over 100 years. So that by virtue means that we predate the United Nations. In fact, we were created at the time of the League of Nations. And the very initial idea for the ICC was first sort of conceived towards the very end of the 19th century by big businesses between Europe and North America. The idea was that if you had more integrated markets, you were less likely or less prone to go into conflict. And so that was the original hypothesis from which this organization came and grew to what it is today. The reason why I'd like to emphasize the time is to say that ICC has existed across many generations. And in fact, looking beyond a single generation is rooted within its DNA. Unfortunately, if I was just to be very candid here, that's perhaps not the reality for most businesses around the world, and specifically most large businesses, because they are still operating largely on quarterly timelines against quarterly performance metrics. This is the case at least for larger businesses. And so to have this conversation about protecting future generations is actually quite intuitive, and it makes perfect sense for an international chamber of commerce. But for it to translate just as well to everyday businesses, for it to translate just as well to large businesses who, for the most part, are also contending with the very crises that came about since COVID-19, asking them to think long-term, asking them to log beyond just profits and think and lean more into purpose, we almost have to tweak the ways in which we talk about protecting future generations. And so this is sort of our attempt to do just that. The first thing is to highlight what David had mentioned in his presentation, which is over the next 60 years, we will be most likely to welcome that next 8 billion. As much as that poses governance questions specifically for public sector and multilateral institutions, it also warrants greater private sector leadership, because this will require more companies or greater capacity from companies to help feed, to help house, to provide more care, and to industrialize a greater populace without putting more and more strain on the environment as well. So this is the kind of conundrum, or as we like to say, opportunity that's presented to the private sector. 8 billion people is a huge and will be a highly sought after competitive market. And what we're sort of communicating is that profit margins will be won by those companies that can hold long-term and more stable profits. So it doesn't necessarily matter if you can game the system to be able to maximize your profits over the next quarter, over the next 2 years. What's more important over this generational market is to be able to have more longer term earnings, more stable earnings. To get that, or to really win in that kind of context, you also have to be a company that understands the real currency of future markets, which is trust. That is the underlying currency of future markets. So that's to say that companies that invest in having greater rapport with their clients, with their suppliers, that meet and work actively with regulators, that support the communities and invest into the communities that they operate in, and just have a greater relationship with the public, are more likely to have material gains while other rival competitors sort of lag behind. So what we're basically saying is, in the new economy, profit and purpose are one and the same. It's no longer a question now where we have to sort of prioritize, compromise bits of one to be able to make room for the other as well. And what we're saying is, the first movers, the ones who are most likely to win in this new 8 billion market, this opportunity that it presents itself as, particularly in more vulnerable markets of Africa and South Asia, are those who recognize the importance of measuring profits over a longer term, and who also recognize that you need to make sure that your mission is more integrally tied and reflected in your supply chains, in your governance structures, in how you incentivize employee performance and public engagement as well. I'll give you a few examples to sort of put this into perspective. There was a survey done of the big chief financial officers of the world. And a question was presented to them, which was, if you were given an opportunity to invest in a project which actually is going to do well for future generations, for generations to come, and in fact is net positive financially as well, but it meant that you would have to miss your quarterly targets by 1 penny, just 1 penny. About 50% of the CFOs said they will not take that risk. So the very incentive structure, the very bonus schemes, employee retention, it's all incentivizing this very transactional, hyper-capitalistic way of operating, which is self-defeating first and foremost, but also doesn't enable companies, large companies in this case, to be able to meet the expectations of future generations. Now, let's compare that example to a company like Novo Nordisk, based in the Nordics. They are a company that, for the most part, provides insulin for people who have type 2 diabetes. They pivoted their mission statement to say that we are a company now that is in the business of trying to end type 2 diabetes. So in many ways, that defeats the purpose of their company, because it means that those people who have it, they'll have less of a market to sort of provide services to, right? But in making that their mission, in reflecting that, to be honest, in their operations, what they did was they invested in programs that supported more health outcomes in the global South. They invested more heavily in trying to reduce instances of obesity, for example, or sugar intake, for example. In turn, that made them the preferred supplier for major hospitals around the world. In turn, they became the major sort of preferred tender whenever government programs or government contracts would go out. And they've sort of come into a space now where they are the largest provider now of insulin services. And in fact, Novo Nordisk is now the second most valuable European company. And that's something that's happened so much so over the last few decades. In fact, in the last quarter, I know I've just said not to measure quarter, but just to give you some context, in the last quarter, Novo Nordisk actually performed higher than Nestle. Nestle, the very food company that about 50% of its products actually are considered unhealthy. So here comes a company dedicated towards creating more healthy environments, trying to do that intentionally, trying to do that without it seeming like they're co-opting the space, doing it very authentically, getting to a space where they've become the preferred supplier. They've become so trusted by their clients, by the public, by the regulators, so much so that they're now the second most valuable company in Europe. And in fact, just earlier this year, we're able to outperform a massive, massive giant like Nestle, who arguably is sort of generating some products, at least half of its products in a recent survey, which is considered unhealthy. So this is just an example to say it's not something where you have to compromise. If you do it intentionally and go all the way, even when it seems to run contrary to your profit objective, you will actually win, because if you measure performance over the longer term, if you're prioritizing longer, more stable earnings, you will win in that market as well. I'll give you another example. In this case, I won't mention the company name. This is a company operating in sub-Saharan Africa, and it's a heavy industries sort of company. This company was known to sort of hoard water supply from its host communities, but it never showed up on the balance sheet. So they kept winning again and again and again and again and again until until more recently, they were slapped with an order to conduct a feasibility study on a desalination plant, which would cost them upwards of about $1 billion. At the same time, they were actually beginning to receive less and less permits to conduct on new sites. So what happened on the longer term was that they got hit with this big CapEx expenditure. At the same time, they were becoming less and less likely to obtain the kind of permits required for them to operate in those more vulnerable markets. So it's to say, yes, as much as you might win now, you might win in the next quarter, you might actually win perhaps over a 5-year timeline. But as future majority economies come into themselves, begin to sort of represent their own indigenous values in what they prioritize in terms of the kind of businesses that they want to succeed, what that will mean is that for all companies, SMEs, large companies, you will also have to fall in line as well and realize the most important currency is trust. Meaning, if you are able to build that rapport once again, if you're able to realize that the measurement of performance, it's not to say stop doing it, but to actually look at it from a longer term horizon, that will begin to free up a company, not only to win more profit, to win more earnings, but also to be more of a positive ancestor in the ways in which companies as entities also prioritize and respond to the interests of future generations. Practically, with those case studies that we're beginning to source more and more of from our network, we're also trying to create a declaration for future generations from the perspective of the private sector as well. So we're trying to create principles now of what does it specifically mean for governance? What does it specifically mean for your incentive structures? What does it specifically mean for revamping your supply chain and making sure you do not engage in the sort of bribery or corruption related activities that present yourself, even if it presents smaller wins in the short term. So we're also trying as best as we can to make this tangible, to make this relevant, this topic of future generations for the private sector. And we should have this product by the close of this year as well. And so I'm happy to keep in tabs with anyone here who's interested to follow too.
Perfect. Thank you so much for this insight. Very interesting how you mentioned this relationship between profit and purpose. And, you know, it's always interesting also talking about what the currency is for business, right? And in this case, the currency is also taking into consideration the long-termist perspective. We're going to go back to thinking about what are our closing thoughts on this panel. We're gonna go with the previous speakers and we're gonna ask them to provide to us in say 90 seconds or so, what do they think is the main takeaway lesson or message that they want the audience to have? And as well as we are providing these insights and these conclusions, I welcome the audience to send whether they have a couple of questions to our panelists, they can send it on the chat, and I will very happily provide these questions to them so we can close up this session. So we're gonna go back to Ruth, so we can have a perspective on Ruth. What do you think are our takeaways from this session? And could you give us an idea of how we can build an international system that is very able to think, plan, and act for the future?
Challenging and so many good points, but I just want to focus on agency and action. It seems to me that this whole side of things on policy, solutions, possibility, opportunity is inherently connected and is about youth leadership and intergenerational dialogue. If I can also add one more little point, and that is to point to Abdullahi's declaration out of the business private sector. It would be fantastic if other sectors also thought about doing a declaration from their perspective.
Perfect. Khaled, I'm interested in also knowing what your thoughts are on what the future is for the international system to think and act for the future, and how do you think also national governments can better do this?
What I've noticed actually during our work is that when we connected with both local and international stakeholders, international to understand what worked better. We talked to Singapore Economic Development Board, we talked to Rwanda, we talked to, especially in kind of countries where they went very quickly from an underdevelopment state to a developed state, to understand how they did it, but also why did it work. And the understanding is put everybody around the table. and be very inclusive, not only doing top down, but understanding each community's requirements, needs, and how they want to grow and develop. And so for me, that's the takeaway is no matter how much we think about how to prioritize economic, social, climate issues, we actually need to work with the communities and put them around the table that are impacted and most interested by these elements.
Thank you so much, Khaled. Claudette, moving to you, what do you think are the main takeaways, and how can we have more people, maybe from civil society and other actors from around the world, join us in this conversation?
Yes, thank you, Valeria. I really like Khaled's and Ruth's interventions. So I think that besides building a pipeline of young leaders ready to tackle whatever risk the future holds, I think that addressing inequality has to be at the forefront of our strategies, because we must also acknowledge that the current system is marred by deeply ingrained inequality disparities, and the way rewards and promotions are structured often exacerbates exclusion. And considering the future's demographics and its emphasis in Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean, we need to introspect and challenge our comfort zones, because even in the smallest things, this will be our legacy to future generations. And finally, I think that, yes, we need to actively facilitate spaces for the young countries, but also the young people, and ensure we're offering sufficient professional and financial support for them to successfully navigate these complex spaces and these complex futures. Because only by this, I think that we can start redefining our international design and moving towards one that is more equitable across regions, but also across times.
Perfect. Abdullahi, do you have anything to add on this?
Yes, I was just going to say, I think when we think about the private sector, it looks maybe and feels different in the global north, of course, as compared to the global south, obviously. But just to say, the kind of private sector capture that we're seeing in the global north doesn't necessarily show up as much in the global south. In fact, when you look, I'm just now talking about my experience as somebody who worked with youth movements in Africa, for example. It's really the public sector that's promoting the most substantive form of short-termism. And sometimes the private sector in sub-Saharan Africa, small to medium-sized enterprises, startups, this new generation of business propping up, is really the only route to sort of repurpose national values, to show it up in new institutions, to really act and protect the interests of future generations in ways that really actually go back to very normative indigenous values that stem from these very regions. So as much as there are concerns about private sector participation and what it looks like in the global north, I almost think it's very, very critical in the global south when we talk about future generations to engage in, because it's perhaps maybe the last remaining institution of power that can be able to think long term. It's very hard to see that same thing happening in the public sector for now, at least.
Thank you. Thank you to our panelists for these amazing interventions. I think we have so many things to continue talking about for the rest of the session. We actually have some interventions prepared for us. I would like to invite Malu Esther from the Simon Institute. I don't know if you have any interventions or takeaways that you would like to share as well. We also have other profiles in the audience that will probably can share some main takeaways for this.
Yes. Hi. So I'm Malu from the Simon Institute, and I wanted to bring something that's a bit more concrete about the policy design when we're talking about future generations, because we talk a lot about future generation as an abstract term, but it's quite hard to think about what it actually means in the decisions we're making today and how to make them impact positively the future. And I wanted to bring the concept of future-proofing and a little bit explain this more in detail. So future-proofing is this idea that we take a policy, a decision that we're making right now, and we're trying to make sure that it has positive or at least neutral effect on future generations. But what that means concretely in terms of policy design can be a bit obscure. So at the Simon Institute, we've built a framework to try to help spell out a little bit more what we need to think about in terms of design. And so we've built this framework called FAIR, which is an acronym for future-proofing, which is the overarching principle, and then 3 criteria. So we have future-proofing and then adaptability, impact, and representation for future generations. And so I just want to go quickly through those things. It might give some ideas. Adaptability means that we need to make sure that this policy is going to be able to change depending on what's going to come in the next 50 years rather than in the next 10 years. So if we're building a highway, what's going to happen with climate change, with global warming? Maybe the materials are not going to be able to sustain extreme heat. So can we already, when we're building the policy right now, think about ways that we can adapt the highway if we need it in the future? The second criteria is thinking about the impact on the long term. So when we're calculating costs and benefits of a policy, we're usually taking numbers between calculating the impact over 1 year or over 10 years, but the numbers change massively if we take this consideration over 100 years. So for example, if we take this highway, if we take the cost benefit analysis of how the maintenance is, how much the maintenance is going to cost over 100 years, but also what economic benefits this highway could bring by linking different cities together over the next 100 years, those numbers, those ratios might change completely. And that might help us understand, is this policy actually good for future long-term rather than just for the next few years? And the last, the third criteria of this FAIR framework is the R, which is representation. And what we mean by representation is when we're talking about stakeholders, we're always thinking there are always stakeholders representing different interests. And we're always missing the interest of future generations because we, by default, the future generations cannot speak for themselves. And so that's where we need to have commissions that represent by proxy the interest to make sure that the people around this highway that are going to be born in the next 50, 60 years, and also the people using this highway, their interests are going to be taken into consideration when we build this policy. So that's one example, this FAIR framework on future-proofing, adaptability, impact, and representation. It's a tool that we can use to try to make thinking and making policies right now for the future a lot more concrete. And so I'd also be interested to know if anyone else has different tools that they're using to try to make this protecting the interest of future generation more practical in the way that we're making decisions right now. Yeah.
Thank you, Malu, for introducing this tool of future proofing. I think actually the Office of Future Generations from the Commissioner for Worlds has actually also talked about future proofing in its work. And I know that Jacob Ellis is here with us in the audience. Jacob, I welcome your intervention, please.
Thank you, Valeria. I hope I'm audible. Thanks for the opportunity to contribute to this important discussion, fascinating discussion. I'm Jack. I'm the lead changemaker for public affairs and international work at the Office of the Future Generations Commissioner for Wales, possibly the longest title on the call today. But I'm also a United Nations Foundation Next Generation Fellow working alongside Claudette. So the concept of future generations is no longer, I think, a distant aspiration. It's becoming the norm from the local level here in Wales to the multilateral stage. Just recently, the UN adopted the Principles for Future Generations, which I was proudly involved in designing. And these principles are a monumental step forward in recognizing the importance of getting the system ready. This milestone demonstrates that shaping a better future is not the responsibility of a single entity or generation, but a collective effort for all. And that the UN system is positioning itself to think, plan, and act for future generations within policy, programs, and processes. And soon I'm hopeful that member states will support the proposed UN Declaration for Future Generations, heralding a new chapter for multilateralism in an age pressurized by short-term challenges. But I want to specifically shed light on the approach taken in Wales and its groundbreaking Wellbeing of Future Generations Act passed in 2015. Our mission is to ensure that we meet the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. It's the definition grounded in our Welsh legislation, but coined by the Brundtland Commission in 1987. It establishes 7 national wellbeing goals, which can be translated back to the 17 SDGs. In fact, Wales is the only country to have legislated to protect the interests of future generations and has set the SDGs in law. The legislation applies to all our public institutions, and establishes an independent Future Generations Commissioner, not too dissimilar to the proposed UN Special Envoy for Future Generations, to advise on implementation and to monitor progress. And it also sets out 50 national indicators and national milestones, which are in place to measure the Act's collective implementation. I won't have the opportunity today to delve into the impact specifically of the Act, but possibly another opportunity in the future. But the future of multilateralism for me is clear. As Dag Hammarskjöld, the second UN Secretary General, once wisely said, never look down to test the ground before taking your next step. Only he who keeps his eyes fixed on the far horizon will find the right road. These words resonate deeply with me, our approach in Wales and the global movement towards a future-orientated mindset. We understand that our actions today lay the foundation for a sustainable tomorrow for those not yet born. Our future generations are demanding our attention. Our children and their grandchildren and all those in multilateralism must now respond, drawing on international best practice, chartering new approaches and supporting particularly future majority countries in Africa and Asia with the investment, resources and support to get future ready. And it's why I support a group of 25 Future Generations global ambassadors and a Future Generations action group, as Claudette has outlined, mobilizing young people to accelerate local action and channel their advocacy towards policy leaders. And in a partnership between the Office of the Future Generations Commissioner for Wales and Foundations for Tomorrow, we've developed a free online course which has encouraged over 500 young people globally to think, plan and act for future generations, including also a policy toolkit for parliamentarians and politicians. So in quick summary to end, I think we need to put continued efforts on educating people about what we mean by future generations. I still think that that's necessary. I think we have to find space for new ideas and new concepts, understanding that some have tried things, but not one size fits all. I think we have to establish independent representative structures or institutions and to identify where appropriate regulatory or legislative opportunities to necessitate a shift to long-term thinking. Thank you. Diolch.
Thank you, Jack. I know we also have Corinne Momo-Vanian from the Coffee and Allen Foundation. I welcome your intervention, Corinne.
Thank you, Valeria. I mean, it's a very, very difficult act to follow, Jacob, because Wales has done just so much, and we were actually one of the first to highlight the Welsh Future Generation Act as a fantastic model to follow. But listen, there's so much that comes to mind also after David's presentation today, and I'll maybe focus on just on the issue of really governance and multilateralism, because Jacob presented quite a sort of optimistic view of what the UN is doing, and I find there's this schizophrenic atmosphere at the UN at the moment, with all this incredible work done by the Secretary General and by people like Jacob around him, and or all the plans for the summit for the future, and then there is this incredible resistance on the other hand. I mean, we've heard recently of the questioning even of the summit for the future, which really broke my heart, and the questioning by the very countries where the future generations are, which this is where I talk about schizophrenia, and I'm sorry if I'm bringing up controversial and difficult issues, but I think we have to face them. What David has presented in his slides, I think that slide about the population in a few decades should be compulsory reading for the Security Council, which refuses to reform itself, and I think that if it was to be presented to some of the member states, at least maybe it would really make the case for obvious reforms, such as the fact that Africa needs to have a permanent seat on the Security Council, that India needs to have a permanent seat on the Security Council. So I think we need to use this fantastic presentation to give a new push to the momentum for reform that has been stalled. That's one of my comments today. The fact that the fact that the multilateral system is more necessary than ever to confront the global challenges that we have. And the fact that this multilateral system is slowly losing legitimacy because of the impossibility to reform it is of great, great concern to me. So, and the legitimacy is also being lost not only because the structure is antiquated, but because, and this is something that David has heard me say before, even the secretariats, the whole UN system is refusing to rejuvenate the proportion of young people in the secretariat. The proportion of people who are younger than 30 in the organizations is less than 2% of the staff, and that's just not on. It's just not representative. And so it's not only the member states delegation, but it's also the people working in the organization. So very, very quickly, just a couple of more reflection of what can be done, and also what is, I think, a risk associated with talking too much about risks. And some of the comments in the chat were very good. We have to be very, very careful. Just this week, the Reuters Institute of Oxford University published a study showing that people are just turning off the news. They do not want to hear about these risks anymore. People have climate change fatigue. Young people are suffering from mental health even more because of all the constant repeating of all the risks that we are facing, the existential risks that we're facing. So we really have to be very, very careful. And of course, we have to assess these risks and understand them, but we have to shift some of the advocacy work. What are the solutions? How can we work together? When we look at the slides that David presented, we have to look at the opportunities presented by the incredible demographic dynamism of Africa, for instance, and that means that, we have to shift the minds of policymakers from, this is awful. We have 8 billion people who are going to be born in the next 60 years, to a mindset that this is such an incredible opportunity. Our companies today are already lacking the necessary labor force. We have these young people coming onto the market. That's also maybe addressed to Abdullahi, something that the ICC has to do. Very, very quickly, we have to really change the way we do advocacy. As I was saying, we have to look at some of the excellent comments in the chat. I've talked about envisioning exercises, transformative scenarios. So that's the thing that we have to focus on. The second thing we have to do more, we have to build, as several people have said, this pipeline of young leaders. They are there, but we really have to help them and empower them. And the third thing, and that's also coming back to what Abdullahi had said, is if the institutions are not going to reform themselves, we have to sidestep them. And the private sector has a huge role to play there because it is so much more flexible and dynamic. So one of the things that we do, for instance, at the foundation is really work with partners on helping young entrepreneurs in Africa in particular. So I'll stop here because I know there are so many, but it was such a fantastic discussion. It could go on forever. Thank you.
Thank you, Corinne, for those encouraging words and new perspectives. Daria, I welcome your intervention as well. Daria from the School of International Futures.
Hi, thank you so much. It's fantastic actually to be coming after Corinne and after Jack. I feel like I'm probably kind of standing in the middle with. We've been working on the topic of intergenerational fairness for over 5 years now. And yes, it's becoming recognized in manifestos, treaties, courses. Yes, we've seen it being put on the agenda, but I do think that when it comes to putting it into practice, we still have quite a couple of challenges ahead. If nothing else, because, there are just so many crises that are kind of present that are urging political attention, basically. So I feel like we still have a way to go. And I feel like it's sessions like this that kind of enable us to connect, to share, to learn from one another, to kind of be reminded of what the challenges perhaps and the opportunities are, and where examples of kind of excellent work in this field are being done that are so powerful and so useful. So thank you all so much for your contributions, the panelists, as well as for organizing this session. I'm just going to, I feel like a lot of what I wanted to say has already been mentioned. So, which has to do about how can we bring this work forward. So I'll just take the opportunity to talk about the theory of change and the approach through which we've been working towards kind of increasing fairness for present as well as future generations. And you'll hear a lot about transformative scenarios, dialogues, and things like that that have been said already. But I'll just kind of pull it together and share a little bit about what we focus on at SWAF. So basically, we're also firmly believing that for change to happen, it needs to happen on a systems level. And there needs to come pressure on different levels. And we specifically focus on 3 different levels: inside of the political system, and then outside and globally. And so first, we've developed a framework on assessing on intergenerational fairness policy assessment that I've shared in the link as well. This was done in collaboration with the Calouste Gulbenkian. And basically the framework focuses on 3 kind of aspects resulting in interventions on those 3 levels. So the first one is through intergenerational dialogues, which are supported by foresight as well as by data. And here, coming back to what Corinne had just said, we have networks of kind of next generation foresight practitioners, young people globally, and we can kind of mobilize those networks as needed and try to engage them in scrutinizing policy, having those relevant conversations, kind of putting them in a place where, we can try to reestablish and build trust between young people and decision-making, as well as then kind of bring their concerns and connect them to members of the parliament in the specific regions or countries. Then the second element is the intergenerational policy assessment tool itself, which is really there to scrutinize policies, kind of a technocratic solution more, to scrutinize policies on how intergenerationally fair they are and to support then decisions and drive transparency as well as accountability. And the last bit is kind of the focus on building institutional capacity, which I think that we've also heard quite a bit about today. And here, one example just to throw here is that we're kind of convening a network of future pioneers, leading thinkers, working on topics of anticipatory governance, foresight, future generations, and so on. We have a safe space to connect, to exchange information. So I'll just stop here. Thank you all so much. It's been really powerful and energizing, and I hope that we kind of continue having these spaces and exchanging ideas and working on this together.
Thank you, everyone, for sharing these inspiring interventions and for providing so much information about the work that you already conduct. I think it's also something that we will continue to look forward to learn more about. Before sharing the screen again with David, Stephen, I would like to as well share a little bit of the perspective as someone that has worked in the Y20, which is a youth track of the G20, and also, of course, from my work as a Next Generation Fellow. So I think there are 2 main points that I would like to bring as well into the table, which is, first of all, talking about structural change in institutions that we need in order to guarantee interventions from young people, which can act, of course, as proxies for future generations. And the second point that I want to make is asking ourselves, what type of future is that the one that we're trying to guarantee or secure for future generations? So to begin with, I would like to talk about this structural change. As a Mexican representative for the Y20, I work in the track Shared Future, which talks about governance and democracy. And one of the things that we're trying to push forward, all of the delegates of the Y20, is the idea of having a youth representatives for the future delegation that works in the G20. So one of the proposals that we're trying to push this year in Varanasi, India, where the next Y20 summit will take place, is to guarantee that at a structural level, we have those young voices that can be part of the decision making. Of course, there are many conversations yet to be had on what this decision making means at an institution like the G20. But to begin with, we want to make sure that we're there in those conversations, because one of the main things that many young activists and young representatives like myself have faced is that we continue providing all of this youth perspectives and creating all of these communiques and incredible, inspiring research from our young perspective. And then we provide it to the decision makers and we never hear back from them. And we never really understand where these inputs are being, you know, followed up, or if they are being provided any type of action. So we really need to start thinking about this institutional representation that is so very important, not only at the United Nations, but also at other international institutions and forums like the G20. And I think it's very important that, I mean, I have seen from the chat that all of you come from different NGOs and foundations. And I encourage you to start thinking about what type of structural change we can bring in order to make sure that we follow up on these demands and comments and perspectives that young people are already providing. And these can be from multiple perspectives. If we think from the local or national perspectives, we already have multiple youth councils around the world that work really hard, and multiple times they're not being paid for this work that they provide. And yet again, we are asking ourselves as young representatives, what is the purpose of this work? I'm not being, I mean, it's not about the money at the end of the day, right? But like, we're having these conversations of, we want to institutionalize our work, yet we don't know what is happening with it. Is our time and effort worth it? I personally think it is, and from my experience, I know it is. But we also want to hear back from decision makers in these different organizations that you all represent. And last but not least, moving on the question of what type of future we're trying to secure or guarantee for future generations. My work here in the University of Oxford as a master's degree student has focused on asking ourselves, taking a step back from the decision-making perspective or hat, and thinking at slightly a more philosophical level, asking ourselves from different schools of thought, the Rawlsian justice approach, the utilitarian approach, the environmental justice approach, and also the intergenerational equity school, asking ourselves, what exactly are we striving to do? And what I have found from my research after looking at multiple declarations from the UN system is that we are talking about future generations without taking a step back and asking ourselves what exactly is what we're striving for. And briefly, if I'm able to introduce a personal perspective on this from my research, is that I find incredibly interesting from looking at these declarations that we're talking about climate change and future generations, understanding that, of course, they go hand in hand. Yet again, when we talk about future generations, we always talk about this human-centered approach, when in reality, if we are putting at the center of the conversation the climate perspective when it comes to future generations, we should also be thinking about putting that environmental perspective at the center if we are to guarantee any type of future for those yet to be born. So this is just an invitation to also look at this other point of view of what exactly are we talking about when we are questioning ourselves to guarantee a future for future generations. I mean, the Rawlsian perspective is all about presenting this opportunities for everyone. But then if we look at the environmental perspective, we're asking ourselves, well, what do we have to guarantee as well for the environment so we can provide a better future for everyone? I mean, this conversation can continue for so much longer, but this is just my 2 cents or my grain of salt for this conversation. And I would like to also provide the screen, hand the mic to David Stevens so he can provide to us a few concluding remarks.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I hope you can hear me okay. It's Friday lunchtime in Italy. Everybody's come home for lunch and is using the bandwidth like crazy. So I may break up a little bit. I mean, it's just been such a rich conversation. I won't try and summarize, but I'm just going to pick up on something Corinne said. The politics around the Summit of the Future are difficult at the moment. I think we should be aware of it, but not panic about it. And I think this conversation shows us that we should respond in 3 or 4 ways. First of all, we need more conversations about the content that we're hoping this summit is going to explore and discuss. I mean, I've been involved in so many of these processes, and the conversation is all about the process and it's not about the substance. And we still have time to make this a rich conversation about substance. Secondly, I made this point earlier, we need to think more about solutions than problems. And that's partly the opportunities piece in a world where young people are going to be a smaller and smaller proportion of the population and therefore an increasingly scarce resource. But it's also about the solutions around risks as well. But problems create bad politics in the international system. They drive people into corners. Solutions create a very different type of type of conversation. Third, I think we need to bring in some people who can tell good stories about the summit, stories that create space for discussion and debate. And it needs a kind of creative approach as well as a substantive research policy-based approach. And I think finally, and Corinne said this, we need to really talk directly to countries about what their profile in the future looks like. You know, Valeria, Aisha, others on this call were involved in Stockholm Plus 50, co-hosted by Kenya and Sweden. I think it's fair to say the Swedes were more keen than the Kenyans on talking about the future of Stockholm Plus 50, but the future is going to be born in Kenya, not in Sweden. And I think we need to be quite firm about having that debate about this unrecognized interest in the future in countries where the majority of future generations are going to be born. And my confidence is that the politics will switch around really quite quickly once the debate happens in those terms, and particularly when younger voices in those countries begin to make that point. So I am full of hope. I do think this is a moment where we can change the way that the international system thinks, plans, and acts for the future. And I do think that is something that member states desperately need to happen, even if not all of them realize that yet. I think the kind of partners that have come together in this call at the beginning of a nucleus that can work together in a very informal way to create the conditions, the political conditions and the substantive conditions for success over the next year and then beyond that. And I think the fact that we have such a strong representation from next generation voices indicates that this is a debate that's not going to be, about the patterns of the past, but is going to be driven in some quite surprising directions that are about the future. So thank you so much to the panelists for coming. Thank you so much to everybody who intervened from the floor, to Valeria for being our host and convener today, and for the team from the Futures Conference for allowing us to have this session. Please do get in touch, send us materials, and we'll really try and build a list of people who can work together on this thing. So Valeria, over to you just for the final farewell.
Well, thank you everyone for gifting us your time, because as we have already discussed, we have so many more things to do for this topic. And on behalf of the UN Foundation, I would like to invite everyone to continue engaging with us and our partners in making the Summit of the Future, of course, a decisive moment for the next 8 billion and for future generations. I mean, you have already seen it in the chat. There's so many interesting conversations going on. I do invite you to continue connecting with each other. And we have also shared resources that could probably be useful for your work, including our common agenda, our future agenda, and of course, the paper Future Thinking of Future Generations. David's presentation is also available, and we encourage everyone to continue the conversation outside this session. So thank you once again to everyone. I hope we have an exciting and amazing path ahead when it comes to future generations. And I hope to see everyone in our next special session. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Thanks.